Second approach to moral decision making that we're looking at this week is utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism. And if you look at the resources that I've given you this week, one of them is a very old BBC. For some reason, on the BBC website, they had an ethics guide at one time, which is great. I think it's pretty good. But the idea of consequentialism is a simple and really a familiar idea right here. Most important being whether an act is right or wrong depends only on the results of that act. And, an ancillary principle here, the more good consequences an act produces, the better or more right that act. This is something I think that we're all familiar with. And I think I really am of the belief that we're all familiar with Kantianism too, that is kind of built into our way of looking at the world. But I think in a more obvious way, perhaps consequentialism and utilitarianism, which is really the only form of consequentialism that we'll be really looking at, is also built into our way of looking at the world. That is, it's the most obvious thing in the world that we should care about the results of our actions. The only thing that we would have to specify is that we should care about the results of our actions both on ourselves and on other people. And utilitarianism is very much focused on that. Utilitarianism states that people should maximize human welfare or well-being. And it gives you an explanation here of why, which they used to call utility, hence the name. That is, utilitarianism is really, you could call it happinessarianism. That is, to be a utilitarian is to follow John Stuart Mill and the greatest happiness principle. Which is, I've just give you a very short excerpt from Mill's Utilitarianism here, but a very key section where he says, the creed which accepts as the foundation, that is the basis, the most important thing, the essence of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. That is, utilitarianism is not a selfish philosophy. It is perhaps the most unselfish philosophy there can be, in the sense that what you're asked to do as a utilitarian in regard to anything that you do is to try to anticipate the consequences of your actions on human happiness in general, both on your own happiness and on the happiness of others, and what is most important to note there, to give them equal weight. That is, if I'm thinking of doing something and I'm anticipating, I'm calculating the consequences of that action, I should be guided by my anticipation of both how it will affect my own happiness, but how it will affect others too. And I should not, in general, as a rule, give my own happiness or unhappiness any more weight than anyone else's. And that's really what you're trying to do, according to the utilitarian, in everything that you do, is to maximize the total amount of happiness in the world, and to minimize the total amount of unhappiness in the world. Mill goes on here to specify a little, and he says, by happiness is intended pleasure. Just to simplify things, happiness is defined as pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure, the taking away of pleasure. So one may say that what you're trying to do as a utilitarian is to maximize the total amount of pleasure experienced by, let's just say, human beings right now. Because again, that issue of animals that came up in in Kant is a very important one, but not one that was dealt with either by Mill or Kant in any kind of systematic way, any kind of serious way. But so let's just say human beings. What you're trying to do is to increase the total amount of pleasure experienced by human beings and to reduce the total amount of pain experienced by human beings. He goes on to say, to give a clear view of the moral standards set up by the theory, much more requires to be said, in particular what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. Mill is actually quite concerned with the different sorts of pleasures and is very concerned with making it clear that he considers some pleasures to be higher or more important than others, intellectual, social pleasures as opposed to bodily pleasures. But that is, let's just leave that an open question for the moment, because we don't have to get into those aspects of it. He continues, but these supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. So just as Kant found the human person to be the thing that was something that was intrinsically valuable when he was explaining the second categorical imperative, and that serves as a kind of a foundation for his morality, his theory of morality. The pleasure is what Mill identifies, pleasure and freedom from pain, as things which are inherently valuable, things that we would always choose. And that's the basis of his moral theory. And that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. There's nothing really I can really add to what's here. That's a wonderful thing about utilitarianism, is that it is, once it's pointed out to you, it tends to just seem obvious because it's kind of built into your behaviors already. There are some very helpful things here in the BBC page, differentiating act consequentialism or act utilitarianism from rule or rule consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is an interesting and important distinction within the theory, but not something that we need to get into too much. So if Kant was giving you guidance in decision making in the categorical imperatives, what was he saying? Make sure that whatever you do, your rule of action, your maxim of action needs to be universalizable. And he was saying in the second version, whatever you do, make sure you never use a person and exploit them. Make sure that you never treat a person like a thing. Okay. Always treat them as a person, as having inherent worth. Always treat them with respect. What is the utilitarian saying? Whatever you do, make sure that the results of your action have the most positive impact on human welfare in general. Make sure that whatever you do, you are either increasing human happiness to the greatest extent or decreasing it to the least extent, because clearly there are some situations in which what we do, we are forced to make ourselves and others unhappy, at least in the short term. Minimize the extent of that unhappiness. I don't think there's that much more to say. It is, there's all sorts of interesting conceptual, philosophical questions that come up here. But as far as a rule to follow or a general guidance for ethical decision making, I think it's pretty clear if you just look at the material. Of course, one of the interesting things about Kantianism and utilitarianism, I think, is that both of them are intuitively have very strong appeal to us. We find that For instance, Kant's demand for consistency in the first categorical imperative, that whatever you do, it should be something that you expect everyone else to do, and that if you don't, then you know you shouldn't do it. Or his idea of respect for persons. That's a very, very strong intuitive appeal there, things that we kind of already know. The same is true for utilitarianism. That it seems to be something that we already know and that we already follow. The interesting thing is that when it comes down to it, oftentimes these two things are absolutely incompatible. That's why you come up with, like at the end of this BBC page, when it looks at various problems with utilitarianism, what it's calling consequentialism. For instance, this last one here about how it can be inconsistent with human rights. And it has a thing about, well, let's just read, a billionaire needs an organ transplant. He says that if he is given the next suitable organ, he will fund 1,000 hip replacements a year for 10 years. Giving him the next available organ means Mr. X, who was top of the list, will die. But it also means that thousands of people will be very happy with their new hips. Consequentialism might be used to argue that Mr. X's human rights should be ignored in order to increase the overall amount of human well-being. That's just a perfectly good little hypothetical, but there could be infinite others that people have explored over the years about being in situations where if you were to be a consistent utilitarian, consistent consequentialist, and be devoted to increasing the overall amount of human happiness, that you might actually be doing something wrong, that is violating somebody's rights. I will include perhaps this similar hypothetical from the philosopher Bernard Williams from his critique of utilitarianism, where he offers two scenarios in which being a strict utilitarian would push you to do something, but that in doing so, you might be violating other values that are just as important. That is, in maximizing the overall amount of happiness, you may actually be violating other important moral concerns or moral rules, or you might be, it's not clear. So it's actually quite interesting. I think, which is to say, I think that these two decision-making approaches are quite useful and really indispensable. But in morality and ethics, it's never clear that any approach is really sufficient, and it's not clear that following any one approach always will actually lead you to the right decision. But so yeah, this is all we're doing. The first week is kind of thinking about morality, perhaps in a more rigorous way, and maybe the big idea is that you can approach moral decision making with some degree of systematicity, some degree of method.